Assalamu alaikum, my dear friends. It, it's okay to call you friends, I hope. So it's an honor and a pleasure for me to be with you and being given the opportunity to talk to you and look at some of the very major issues that we face today. And I would like this session to be interactive and call it what you may, like a heart-to-heart conversation that we can have with one another. There would be certain parts of the conversation in which we'll request the parents to give us some secluded time, some dedicated time. And in others, of course, they are most welcome to stay here and talk to one another. And if they have any concerns and questions, of course, they are most welcome as well. As Fatima just introduced, so we'll be covering two major topics today, inshallah, one by one. In our first session, we'll look at how we approach the Quran, what exactly is one of the most important areas that we need to understand if we have to fully comprehend the Quran. And we'll also look at some of the texts of the Quran which relate to our moral development and our conduct. And then finally, we'll look at some of the major global conflicts. Obviously, the most glaring of them is the Palestine-Gaza conflict that's going on today, and that is, of course, a point of great concern, especially its history, its background, and what exactly we can do as disturbed individuals who are worried about what's going on, and what is the role that we can play. So talking about the Quran, all of us, of course, know that as far as the Book of God is concerned, this is the final testament after the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Quran is the final testament. The question that comes to mind is that what's the distinction that the Quran has over the rest of the books? Because generally, we have guidance from God, and what is it that makes us different in approaching our scripture from the rest of the scriptures? So this question has arisen because of the fact that had we the original format of the Old Testament and the New Testament, which means the original language, this perhaps would never have arisen. So the thing that has actually necessitated the revelation of the Quran and ultimately its preservation, the way it was revealed, was the fact that the previous books of God, the Torah that was revealed to Moses, the Injil that was revealed to Jesus, and the Zabur or the Psalms that was revealed to David or Daud, none of these three books are preserved in their original texts. So none of them are found in their original texts. All that we have is basically translations of the original. And not only just translations of translations, and repeatedly the same thing that's going on. And this actually makes something quite difficult, but because we don't know the original text and we have translations, we simply cannot match the translations with the original text and find out whether the translation is correct or not. But because we have the Quran has given us this leverage that we can now study the previous scriptures in the light of the Quran and find out where those scriptures deviate. Why? Because you see, the Quran has said on innumerable occasions and said it many times that the message that was brought down by every prophet of God was always the same, and it was called Islam. So from Adam to Muhammad, peace be upon them, the message was the same. All prophets of God, they brought down the same religion. But because the previous books were not preserved, so we needed a final book because the institution of prophethood was to be terminated. And with that termination, there had to be something left in this world on their behalf, which we could have recourse to and find out what the truth is. So I have had the chance of teaching the Bible, the Torah and the Injil and the Zabur in the last 15 or 20 years. And I can say out of my own experience that almost 80%, if not a little more, of these books, what we have of them today, is the same as what the Quran says. It's just that 20% maybe in which we have that difference, and those differences, of course, have arisen because of a lack of the original text being available, and of course some of the interpolations and distortions that did result in the Torah and in Injil is in that 20%. Otherwise, in the 80% part, you'll find so much similarity between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, if we call them three separate Abrahamic religions, that it's simply amazing. And that is why these three faiths are also called monotheistic faiths, and they have their own distinctions. But primarily, if someone asks you that why is it that you would stick to the Quran and you would be more comfortable in approaching God, in getting to God, in accessing God through the Quran and not the previous scriptures. So the answer is very simple, that had the previous scriptures been preserved in the original language, we would have known what God had actually said, and we would have had no bias and would have had recourse to those scriptures as well. In the absence of the original text, it's just a necessity. It's something that we're compelled to, that we approach the Almighty, access the Almighty through something which is more reliable, something which is more, we can verify that. And so if I'm a person who's neither a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian, not a follower of the Abrahamic religions, and if I am born in this world, and if I know that amongst this world there are individuals who think that they have the final word of God, they have the final book of God, so my duty or my responsibility as a seeker of the truth, which is a responsibility of every one of us. So to seek the truth is a responsibility that every person who's cognizant of the truth, who would like to move forward in life and have recourse to the scriptures is equipped with. So if I get this message in this world that there is one group called Muslims who claim that they have the final word of God in its original language, so my natural, I would say, course of action as a truth seeker would be to verify whether they are telling the truth or not. And if I, for example, if I'm not being able to verify or I don't agree with them, then maybe I do have an excuse and I'll present that to God. But if I have not even given this a chance to find out whether this claim is true or not, then someone could be asked, and God could ask us, that why is it that there was this information that came to you, that there is a book that is accessible to you and it takes you to me, and you have not given it enough thought to at least verify whether the book was correct or not. So the point that I'm making is that this is the distinction that Muslims, being unbiased, should have, that they think that they have the message of the Quran or the message of God in its final and ultimate form. And if there is any doubt, of course, that is something that we can always approach and discuss. But once you are convinced that this is something from God, then I think any logical person who belongs to any faith, it should not be any point of bias or prejudice for him that he is clinging to the Quran. It's not that clinging to the Quran is not because he's a Muslim or someone close to God, but simply because objectively he finds out that this is the only book that can be validated and verified as the final message of God. So this is the first point, that when you approach the Quran, when you find out the Quran, how it discusses things, we should actually conduct ourselves through. The second important point actually is something that is much more important, and I'd like to spend a little more time. Maybe I'll draw something for you to make some things more clear. That what exactly is the theme of the Quran, and what exactly is that theme which makes certain parts of the Quran, certain areas of the Quran very, very specific to the era of God's messengers. And there are certain other parts which are extendable and they are valid for all times to come. Unless and until we know this distinction, we might end up doing certain things that we are not actually authorized to do, and which we have been doing. So for example, when I talk about we, of course it means the Muslim Ummah. So when I talk about this, I talk about people like Mullah Umar, I talk about people like Osama bin Laden, I talk about a person like Abu Bakr Baghdadi. So all of these people, what they do is they derive a lot of directives from the era of Prophet, of the Messenger of God, and they think that, well, there are certain things that he did, and there are certain things which he was ordered to do. For example, to kill the idolaters, or to wage jihad against people and impose jizya upon them, or to not make friends with the people of the book, or, for example, not pray for their salvation in any way. So when they read these verses and they find out that this anger of God is boiling everywhere in the Quran, they feel the same hate for people around them who actually do not in any way conform to this. So it is here that I'd like to draw your attention to this fact that we need to understand the Quran when we approach the Quran in a very significant and a very special way, because there are some specifics of the Quran which, if not understood, they might actually lead us to erroneously interpret some of the harsh verses of the Quran, some of the verses that are inexplicable today, that why should we kill non-Muslims, or why is it that we are, for example, required to wage war with them and subdue them in the name of Islam? Because this is what generally people who understand the message of Quran, they are doing. And it is from here also that you can link up this very important area or very important global debate, although you might be discussing it in detail in our next session, but you can link it with this understanding of the Quran, that Islamophobia also has a lot to do with this erroneous understanding of certain verses of the Quran, which are actually specific to Prophet Muhammad's era, and they do not apply to post-prophetic era. And we actually have extrapolated them. We have sort of interpreted them to mean that, well, the way they are revealed to the Prophet, they are equally applicable to us. Yes, the question does arise that if they are not applicable to us, why is it that they are still found in the Quran, and what message do those verses have for us? So for that I'll just try to explain this whole phenomena. And I mean, this is a oversimplified, I would say, religious history of humankind, that I would call it. So if you're able to make sense of this and you're able to understand this, you'll be able to gauge what exactly has happened and where this misinterpretation or wrong approach towards the Quran can be seen very clearly. So this era of Adam to Muhammad, of course, this is a very specific era. This is an era that everyone can call this era as the prophetic period, because this is that part of history or religious history in which prophets of God would come, and of course they would deliver their message, and certain things would happen, and then of course they would leave this world. So this is the prophetic era. And then I would say this is the second, let's say this is the Day of Judgment. So I'm just going to write DOJ. So this is, till the Day of Judgment, this can be called the post-prophetic era. And then we have this Day of Judgment. The theme of the Day of Judgment, of course, if I can just use one word, is accountability. So this is like reward and punishment being taken place. And so you can see these three distinct parts of this worldly life and that worldly life. So this worldly life is like this. It's all the way from Adam to the Day of Judgment. And then we have the Day of Judgment itself. And probably after that, of course, people will branch out into heaven or hell. It's like an oversimplification, but you can see that this is generally what's going to happen. So now the important thing is, there is a very specific feature of this prophetic era. And this feature is something that cannot be pushed into the post-prophetic era. And you know what that is? So you see, this accountability, which is going to take place on the Day of Judgment, is something that all of us are required to be mindful of. So basically, the theme of the Quran is that we have to gear ourselves for this next worldly accountability. And this accountability is something that we are reminded of through a number of things. For example, our own conscience tells us what right and wrong are, and our own conscience tells us that, well, right and wrong must be judged one day. Otherwise, what is the benefit or reason for giving us this conscience and then not being judged accordingly? So similarly, a very, very prominent theme of the scriptures is that in order to make this accountability something that we never forget, and we keep on reminding ourselves of, that what happens is that this accountability, which is going to take place on the Day of Judgment by the Almighty on the basis of our deeds. So what happens is that this accountability takes place in the era of every messenger of God, So, for example, from Adam we have Noah, and then slightly later we had Abraham, and similarly Moses, and then Jesus, and I'm skipping a lot of other messengers, just the main ones, and then we have Prophet Muhammad. So what happened was that in this accountability, which is destined and ordained to take place on the day of judgment, in order to make it an observable reality, a palpable reality, a small rehearsal of this accountability takes place in the life of every messenger of God. So Abraham, Moses, Jesus, of course, and Prophet Muhammad, for the last time, the accountability of people took place in their own eras as well. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that just as this day of judgment is going to happen at the end of time when we appear before God, so in order to make that accountability something that you are going to never forget, what happens is that God creates lesser days of judgment in the time of all his messengers. I mean, so that this accountability, which is going to take place in the hereafter, it becomes something which is observable by people who are living in this era and people like us who are living in the post-prophetic era. For us, when we read the previous scriptures, because remember, all these previous scriptures were revealed in this era. So Muhammad was given the Quran, Jesus was given Injil, Moses was given the Torah, Abraham was also given a scripture which has not fully survived, Noah probably was also given a scripture which has not probably survived. But what has happened is that the Quran, which was revealed to Prophet Muhammad, has actually preserved the tales and the stories and the days of accountability that took place in the era of every messenger of God. So in other words, the accountability that's going to take place in the hereafter took place in the era of every messenger of God. And you know what that means? It actually means that a messenger of God, he delivers the truth on behalf of God. He tells them that I am God's messenger. He proves to them that I am God's messenger. And then people who deliberately deny, I mean, remember this word, it's not a misunderstanding, it's not any misinformation, it's not any lack of information. It's basically that ultimately the messengers that they are able to convince the people in such a way that and except for stubbornness, they don't have any excuse to deny him. This is what we call, if I use this technical term, Itmamul Hujjah, that every messenger of God is able to deliver the truth in its ultimate form. And this is something which once it takes place, it actually necessitates that that nation is then held accountable in this world. So all the nations of these prophets or these messengers, they were held accountable in this world and either destroyed or preserved. And most of them were destroyed because they intentionally denied their prophet. And this intentional denial, as I just said, means that they were convinced that he's a prophet of God in their hearts, but out of arrogance, out of vested interest, out of so many other things, they chose not to accept the messenger. And if you have read the Quran, you must have heard that cyclones and earthquakes and tornadoes and the likes of these natural disasters, they destroyed these nations. And the reason of that destruction is none other than the fact that they denied God's message that was delivered to them through their respective messengers. And this deliberate denial, you know what, is something that it relates to the heart. I mean, I just cannot decipher that if any one of us, or as human beings, we can never know if the message has been put across in its ultimate form and if the message has been denied deliberately or not. So even the messenger of God, they never know that. It is God, actually, who tells each of these messengers that now you have delivered the truth to the ultimate extent, and now it is the time that these people have taken to stubbornness, obduracy, and in spite of knowing the truth, they are bent upon denying it. So a messenger of God is then told that you must leave your nation because now God is going to punish these people for their denial. And then, as a result, we see earthquakes and cyclones and these natural disasters that took place. However, in the times of Prophet Muhammad, there was just one difference. And that difference was that the earthquakes and natural disasters which killed these nations, the nations of these messengers, because of their denial, it took the form of an armed warfare. So it was said that now the punishment that descends on the nations through these natural disasters. This time, it would not be these natural disasters who's going to destroy them. It would be actually through the hands of the disbelievers themselves. The Sahaba were actually deputed as instruments of God's justice. So what we can say is that just as natural disasters were employed to punish the people who had deliberately denied in the era of previous messengers, they were replaced by human instruments of God's justice. And for them, it was essential that if they do not submit and if they do not accept what the truth is, then they were punished. And that punishment is something which is basically a reflection of that punishment that is already going to take place in the hereafter. So if I summarize, I can say the accountability that is going to take place in the hereafter for every single person, that accountability actually took place not in the post-prophetic era, in the prophetic era, in the lifetime of every messenger. And there is I can call that a greater day of judgment. So we had lesser days of judgment, the LDJs, taking place in the era of every messenger of God, so that people like us who are living in the post-prophetic era and reading the Quran and the Torah and the Injil, when they read about the stories of these messengers and how they were destroyed for their denial, they are reminded of the fact that, look here, our accountability might not take place in this world, but it is definitely going to take place in the hereafter. So the reason which I just said, that why is it that that the Quran and the Torah and the Injil preserve certain incidents that are specific to this era and cannot be extrapolated in this post-prophetic era, is simply the reason that people who are living, people like us. So, for example, this is the zero line in which the post-prophetic era started, right up to the day of judgment. All of us who are individuals who would like to convey the message of Islam, we will, of course, talk to our non-Muslim brethren. We will talk to them in the way, you talk to people in a very, very polite way and a very gentle way. But in no way can we threaten them that if they deny this message, then they will be killed or they will be punished or natural disasters will destroy them. Why? Because you see, in that era, God sends his messengers with that powerful message and the technique to deliver it in such an ultimate way that only a messenger can do, and none of us can do that. And secondly, that deliberate denial that I just talked about can only be known when God decides to divulge it. So he decided to divulge that in the era of God's messengers because the institution of Wahi was there, and he could tell his messengers that which of the people had denied. But in the post-prophetic era, the era in which we are now living in, we can never, neither are we so equipped as God's messengers to deliver the truth in its ultimate way, nor can we know if non-Muslims who are our adversaries are intentionally denying or deliberately denying or not. So, therefore, we have to understand that the harsh verses, especially which deal with the punishment of people for kufr, for shirk, for apostasy, they are all verses which relate to this era, and they cannot be extrapolated in any way to this post-prophetic era. And the mistake that has been done by our Islamophobes, I can say, or terrorists, is that when they see that Prophet Muhammad was also given the order and the directive that he can fight the disbelievers and have them destroyed or have them killed, especially if they were the idolaters, then they think that because Prophet Muhammad has been called the best example in the Quran, we know that, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. So they think that if he and the rest of his lot, like other messengers, they also punish people for deliberate denial, so we also are equipped with this. We should also follow them. We should also follow suit. So if you look at Osama bin Laden, for example, before the World Trade Center attacks and other people, whenever they did those attacks, they actually quoted verses from the Quran that related to the prophetic era. And that prophetic era was something that, as I said, was talking about God's messengers. And they started to apply these verses to themselves. And they said that because these are God's messengers and they are the best example, so therefore we should follow their example, without realizing that this is one area in which they can never become examples for us. Because being God's messengers, they were equipped with those arguments, with those miracles, if call them if you may, and of course the power of reasoning, which we never can boast of, which we can never ever think of having. And then God, in order to make an example out of them, and so that people like us who are living here, we think that this accountability, because you see, in this post-prophetic era, when people do bad things, it's not always that they are punished in this world. And when people do good things, it's not always that they are rewarded in this world. So in the post-prophetic era, reward and judgment does not normally take place. But in the prophetic era, reward and judgment or reward and punishment necessarily takes place, because it is like God delivering the verdict through his messengers and then implementing justice. This is not the case in the post-prophetic era. In the post-prophetic era, we as individuals, as common, ordinary human beings, we neither have the power to deliver the truth the way God's messengers can, and nor can we ever see if people who are living or who we are addressing are ones who are maybe deliberately denying or not. So on the basis of this, we can see that a lot of verses of the Quran, a lot of harsh verses on the Quran, for example, a verse which says you kill the idolaters. There's another verse which says you cannot make friends with non-Muslims. Another verse which says that you cannot pray for their forgiveness. And still, I mean, there are so many other verses that I can make a list of so many of them. And then we have a hadith of the Prophet also, which similarly say that non-Muslims, if they convert, then you cannot inherit from them. If a father is a kafir, the son cannot inherit from them, and vice versa as well. So there is a whole list of directives which actually has arisen by not understanding that all these directives relate to the prophetic era. And for the post-prophetic era, they simply don't apply, because they are only applicable in the presence of God's messengers. They simply cannot be extended beyond that era. And so therefore today, when you read the Quran and when you study the Quran and you find out that it says that don't make friends with the Jews and the Christians, or it says that you kill the idolaters. So remember, it's talking about the Jews and the Christians of the prophetic era. Do not impose jizya on them, or do not kill the idolaters of this era, because they were the ones who had intentionally denied, and they were the ones on whom the punishment was implemented. So it would be erroneous to think that a person who's a Jew or a Christian in this time is the same Jew and Christian who's living in this time. Because, you see, the Jew and Christian who was living here was delivered the truth by a person, none other than God's messenger. And plus, about him, it became well known that he had denied the truth or not. But in this post-prophetic era, this can never be known. So, cutting this long story short, I mean, it's a little technical, but it's the reason that I've been taking the pain to go through such details is to make you understand that the harsh verses of the Quran, or verses that make you feel as if you just cannot live with non-Muslims, they are God's vilest creatures on earth, or maybe they are people who are, they don't deserve your love or affection, they must be shunned, they must be hated. This is something that we have to understand has arisen by not understanding the specifics of approaching the Quran. The specifics of approaching the Quran, as I said, are based on the fact that every harshness that you find in the Quran is primarily directed towards the people who their addressees were actually. And today, when we are living in the post-prophetic era, our attitude towards non-Muslims, towards people who are our brethren, who are our maybe fraternity, has to be an attitude in which we acknowledge them, we even love them, we make friends with them, we try to bring them closer, because remember, ultimately, the books that were revealed to each of these messengers had the same message. It's only that the originals of these books have not survived. So now when we talk about the followers of Jesus in the post-prophetic era, the followers of Moses in the post-prophetic era, because these are the two main Abrahamic religions, so now we are confronted with the fact that should we deal with these Jews and Christians in the same way as they were dealt with in the prophetic era? The answer is no. Because, of course, they were recipients of God's messengers through the messengers themselves, and this is not the case here. So this is something that you have to understand, that when you talk to people who maybe blame you of terrorism, or who might think that we are terrorists, Yes, we can in one way say that the people who have become terrorists in our religion have become so because they have extrapolated the practice that was specific to God's messenger to themselves. So in that way, they are guilty of playing the role of God. So that role of God was to be just, that had to be manifested only in the prophetic era. But because they thought that Muhammad and the rest of the messengers, peace be upon them, they are worthy of being copied and they are the best exemplars. So they said, whatever they do, we should also do, without realizing that everything they do, we should do. For example, be good moral individuals, morally pushed individuals. But this particular thing in which punishments takes place was only specific to this era. And the reason that that era still exists in the Quran, its description, is that when we, living in this era, when we read the Quran and when we read the Old Testament, and we see how the nations suffered in this world, we always have this in mind, that our accountability is also going to take place. The only thing is, it's pushed to the day of judgment. For them, the accountability took place in this world. It was meant to take place in this world. For us, it's going to take place in the next world. So if we are able to make sense of this, then I can say that we have correctly understood the Quran vis-a-vis some of its verses, vis-a-vis some of its content that at time or at the moment might not sit well with us. And we as Muslims would always think that, well, we are deputed to kill non-Muslims in the name of Islam, or to spread Islam, or to spread religion in the name of Islam. So all those practices today, which seemingly find ourselves to be in hot waters, are basically those which were regarded to be the part of the prophetic era and which have been erroneously understood to enter the post-prophetic era. So this was the most important thing that as a student of the Quran that I have learned from my teachers, that I wanted to bring forth before you and hence open now the discussion on what I've just said.
I had a question. You said that there are lots of people that were deliberately denying in the prophetic era, despite having the messenger, their miracles, and the book sent to them. Why did they deliberately deny? Why were there so many?
Right. So the Quran actually refers to this and says that they did not want the new religion. They did not want to accept the new religion because that would mean that out of arrogance, the truth has passed on to someone other than them. So basically it was tribal affiliation, it was arrogance, it was jealousy, it was personal interest that impelled them to do so. So basically this is how, and even today when we don't accept the truth, one of the things that stops us from accepting the truth is that we say, well, my family does not believe in this, or my forefathers do not believe in this. So basically it was this push of the forefathers or their tradition-oriented approach that made them decide in this favor.
So my question is, like, what if we need to, there should be a time where we should establish like a Muslim caliphate, right? So these leaders, should they be able to like impose jizya and when they conquer lands? So when it comes time to that,
see, they do not have the authority to impose jizya because see, jizya was meant for people to whom the truth had been delivered by none other than God's prophet. We cannot, boast of that. We cannot say that we have the same capacity or the same stature. So today, yes, if Muslim countries can unite, that's the best thing that can happen to us. But once they unite, they don't have the authority or the prerogative to attack any non-Muslim nation, or maybe subdue it, or bring it under its own surveillance or in its own guidance and impose jizya upon that. So jizya, imposition of jizya or killing of the idolaters was specific to God's messengers. And this is precisely where we have gone wrong. We have misunderstood this part of the messenger's personality, that he was implementing God's will on earth. He was implementing. But we as weak individuals, we don't have the right to do so.
And what about in the future?
What about
in the future? Would there be a time?
In the future as well. This will never happen until the day of judgment. Now, today what is that we must continue to present our message to our non-Muslim brethren and continue to tell them that we have the same origin. So God has revealed all books of God. All that Muhammad, peace be upon him, has been different in is that he has the final message of God in its original form. So if we are asking you, or if God is basically asking them to accept the Quran, it is only because their own books don't survive in their original language. Had they survived, this would have been meaningless. They would have easily been able to follow that. So that is the only thing that is being done. So other than that, if you ask that what else is that does the Quran say about militancy or jihad, then you can say that there's another directive of the Quran, which of course applies to both these eras, the prophetic era and the post-prophetic era, and that is militancy or struggle or jihad against persecution and oppression. So if there is persecution and oppression going on in any part of the world, and a state, as you can say, all Muslim states unite, or maybe one state, then of course that state first it has to have diplomatic ties and tries to create that moral pressure that you must not persecute your people. But let's say those democratic ties and those democratic or diplomatic relations, they fail, then yes, they can still attack that country on the basis of the persecution that is being carried out. But then there are a number of stipulations that you should be in a position to quash that sort of persecution and not ultimately attempt a suicidal mission and be wiped out yourselves. So that has some other important, I would say, stipulations. But the only form of militancy or jihad that is today applicable is against persecution, and it was applicable in the prophetic era. It's also applicable in the post-prophetic era. But as I said, any jihad, any militancy to forcibly convert people or to punish them or to ask them to submit, that was specific to this era. And that is why we actually have been able to not to do this, because we're pulling that prophetic era into our own era as well. And in this way, we are actually guilty of playing God.
Thank you.
You said that during the prophetic era, the people have already been judged.
Yeah.
So does that mean they would not be judged during the day of judgment? And would that outcome be the same as in the era?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you see, for people of the prophetic era, they have been judged and they have been punished in this world. Their punishment is going to continue when they arise on the day of judgment. And not only that, but let's say this is the time in which they are dead. So what happens is that in the land of Barzakh, or in the land in which souls are sent once people die, this punishment that took place in this world is going to continue for them in the land of Barzakh and continue right until the day of judgment. So it's like a threefold punishment for them. Once, when they were there in the times of the prophets and they insisted on their denial. Second, when they died and they passed their lives as individuals in the land of Barzakh. And third, when they'll rise on the day of judgment. So there it's like a threefold punishment. And from this, if I'm allowed to explain this also, that you must have heard of the grave punishment, that people are punished in their graves once they die. That too is something which is only for people of the prophetic era. So people like us, when we die, we are just put to sleep in the land of Barzakh. And that is all. So we will rise on the day of judgment and we will say, well, we just slept a couple of days ago. That's what the Quran says. So basically it will be a deep sleep and they will never experience any reward or punishment as we normally think that they would be. And they will just be sleeping in Barzakh, and then they'll be made to get up. Of course, when they are buried, their bodies, they dissolve, they decay. The souls, of course, are put to the land of Barzakh. They'll arise. They'll rise on the day of judgment. They'll be given new bodies, and then accountability is going to take place, and then they would be rewarded or punished. So in other words, because their accountability had been deferred, so it is but logical that every reward or punishment regarding them should ultimately take place when this accountability has finished. Then they will be made to go to heaven or hell. But for them, because their accountability had already taken place in this world, so it is justified that they are punished in this world, their punishment continues in the land of Barzakh, and it goes right up to on the day of accountability, and then again they will be consigned to hell. So such is the nature of, I would say, this whole endeavor. So the grave punishment that we often talk about, remember, it also relates only to the prophetic era. When we die, every day people are dying, so I have heard so many boys and girls and so many even adults who say that I really fear death, and one of the reasons is that maybe the grave is going to close upon me, and there could be nails, there could be snakes, and all of those things. This is something that we have to understand. It does not relate to us. You don't have to fear death at all. This was meant for those people. For us, the Quran clearly says that you're put to sleep. Your soul is going to go to sleep, so to speak, because your body is going to decay. It's just going to disappear. A couple of years, or maybe 40 or 50 years, if you dig a grave, there's just a skeleton which is there. So there's nothing going to happen to the body. Whatever is going to happen is to the soul. For their souls, they are put into aggravation. For our souls, we are put into sleep.
Thank you.
I think I understand you have written a book on playing God as well.
Yes,
you can-
so whatever I've just described actually has, I've also documented that in the form of some lectures and maybe a book here also. This is called Playing God, which actually describes this whole process with the help of Quranic verses and tells us how the Quran has actually gradedly and gradually given us this information that every single one of us must understand. And if we don't do so, then we will be doing a lot of things that we are not authorized to do simply because the people who are in front of us are not the same people of the book. So you see, here, a Jew or a Christian who was here maybe in the times of Prophet Muhammad was clearly conversant who he was. So the Quran actually says that they were waiting for a final prophet. The Jews and the Christians, they were waiting for a final prophet. And يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم, that they recognized him the way an estranged father recognizes his child. I mean, you just cannot be a person who cannot recognize your child. So they recognized the prophet just as a father recognizes his child. Such was their obduracy or stubbornness that they said, well, even though we think he's the right prophet, but we're not going to believe in them. So that was arrogance, that was family tradition, that was the fact that why is it that prophet has come from another lineage, from another branch of Abraham's progeny. So that is what has led to all this rift. And if you maybe recall that there was a book, you might have studied that, it was called The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington. So this Clash of Civilization that he wrote was actually written on the basis of the fact that Muslims keep fighting, they keep terrorizing people, and very recently we know this claim was made, not very recently, so let me also remind you that this was somewhere in, so today let's say we are here, so this is like 2024, but about a century ago, if you look at this, it's like 1886. So in 1886, we had a Prime Minister of Britain. His name was William Gladstone. So he spoke in the British Parliament once, and he said that as long as these followers of Muhammad exist, and they have the Quran with them, who keeps on telling them to kill the idolaters, to not be friends with non-Muslims, to not pray for them, to be hostile with them. So he referred to this book and said, as long as this book exists on the face of this earth, we can never have world peace. Why? Because he was looking at the interpretations of many of our people who were living in the post-prophetic era. So I talked about Osama bin Laden, I talked about Mullah Omar. These are just recent individuals. I mean, they lived about 10 years ago or 7 years ago. But all these incidents happened earlier on as well. So there were other Mullah Omars, there were other Osama bin Ladens also who existed in this whole period. And I would say, in all sincerity, they thought that this is what they have to do also, that just as Muhammad and his previous predecessors were authorized to kill, they were authorized to impose jizya, we also have the same prerogative. And I think that this is a very, very appropriate juncture of time. If you remember, I mean, most of you might not have been there when this incident of 9/11 took place, or maybe you were very young. The Quran became a bestseller. I mean, it just vanished from the bookshelves because people started to read it very seriously, that what's going on with these Muslims, that they terrorize people or start killing people. And I think this is the best time, living in Australia, living in the UK or in the US, that you can actually explain to them that what's gone wrong. And you can also explain, you know what, something very interesting, that you will find the harshness in the Quran also reflected in the Injil at some instances, and more so in the Torah of that was revealed to Moses. So if you're able to understand all this, you can make sense not only of the Quran, but you can also make sense of a lot of harsh verses which are in the Torah and a lot of harsh verses which are in the Injil. And hence, you can explain their scriptures to them as well. That the harshness that you find in the Torah, you must have heard of this word that they say that our God is the God of love and your God is the God of war. It's precisely because of this reason that the God of love and the God of war have been mixed up. I mean, he has been a God who has always punished people in this era only. I mean, it is only until the prophetic era that God was a God who would implement his punishment. So remember, he's going to be a terrible God, to so to speak in their words, on the day of judgment as well. So if on the day of judgment people are going to be punished, that we all believe, and even if we are Muslims, we will be punished for that. If this can happen here and it be justified, why cannot it happen earlier also if the same circumstances and if the same situation prevails? So if we accept this, it should not be difficult to accept these smaller days of judgment that actually took place on the face of the earth in the times of the prophetic era. I think this is such a important and such a, I would say, it's so significant to our understanding of the Quran that if we are not able to understand that, what happens is that we keep mixing up a lot of things that we have in the Quran or which are not part of our own thesis and make them a part of the prophetic era. And if we are able to understand this distinction, so a drastic change of attitude should result. To us now, every single non-Muslim should be very dear. A person who's a lovable creature, a person who's from the family of God, a person who belongs to the fraternity that we call humankind. This fraternity is our fraternity. So all that harshness has to be explained to them that it was God's way of making this accountability a very, very observable reality in these messengers' eras. And today, in that era that we are existing, we have to address the followers of this religion in a very, very polite and a very gentle way and tell them that basically we are the followers of the same truth and we are the followers of our forefather who is none else but Abraham. So these Abrahamic religions are the ones that have to come forward and sit together, and they will account for maybe 3 or 4 billion people that today exist on the face of the earth. So we have about 7.5 billion today. So if you look at the world count, you'll find more than half of the world population comprising of Abrahamic religions. And if they are made to understand this whole exercise, you'll be, and when we discuss the issue of Palestine and Gaza in our next session, you'll be able to make sense of the fact that a lot of terrorism that is going on from the Jews also, just as Muslims have Osama bin Laden in their ranks, they also have Osama bin Ladens in their ranks. So just as we have become militant by not understanding that there are certain directives only valid in the day of, in the prophetic era, the Jews also have done exactly the same thing, that they think that the same militancy is even allowed today. And they have behaved in the same way regarding the first temple, the second temple, and as we can see, the building of the third temple. So our histories are so similar. It's just a question of understanding them through the Quran. And I think this is such a fundamental, it holds such significance that if we are able to first understand ourselves and then also are able to, let's say, communicate this to our brethren, our fellow brethren, our academics here, our professors here, we can really come together. The Abrahamic religions now have a cause to come together, to become bearers of God's message, and at the same time explain the rifts that we have had in the past. So a lot of persecution which the Jews have suffered in the past. Just recently, 100 years ago, around 100 years ago, the persecution and the genocide that they suffered at the hands of Hitler, the Holocaust, that can also be explained. And similarly, if you look at some of the other very, very, I would say horrific incidents in history, they can also be explained in the light of what we have just studied. It's only that at times people don't realize that what has happened in the prophetic era cannot be pulled away from that era, cannot be extrapolated in the current era. So most of the world conflicts that you today see and you might see in the prophetic era have resulted by not understanding this scheme of God. And whether they are Jews, so remember the Christians, they have become peaceful today. But if you look at the history of Christianity and you look at the Crusades, the way the Crusades happened, because they wanted to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims, so they launched a very similar struggle as what Muslims are doing today to, for example, to bring the rest of the world under their subjugation. So basically what I can say is that all of us three Abrahamic faiths, we have a very similar history. We have a very, you can say, a common era that we can go back to and understand what the Quran has actually said. So in other words, what we can say is that in the post-prophetic era, when we read the Quran and when we read about what had happened, we have to learn that accountability that took place for these people in their own time period is going to take place for us here. So all that I need to do when I read the Quran is to continuously remind myself that I will not be allowed to go scot-free. I will always be taken into account. And if the prophets of God did this in this era, then it's going to bound to happen to us as well. It's just deferred to the day of judgment.